Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is John Paul Jones. I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's event, the Howry Conversation, Noam Chomsky Talks with Tony Massaro. I am extremely grateful to the co-sponsors of tonight's event, the Agnes Noam's Howry Program in Environment and Social Justice, our favorite local nonprofit art house theater, the Loft Cinema, and Tucson entrepreneur Don Martin. The Howry Conversation celebrates the life and values of Agnes Noam Howry, a noted traveler, author, and editor, and a woman with the means to make a dedicated philanthropic commitment to social justice, human rights, indigenous peoples, environmental protection, journalism, the arts, civil liberties, international peace and economic development, and scientific research, especially archaeology and dendrochronology. Her generous bequest to the University of Arizona established a unique program that leverages the power of partnership between the university and our community to address local and regional manifestations of some of the world's most pressing challenges. These include equitable access to life's basic needs like food and education and housing and healthcare, as well as enhancing community resilience and dealing with water availability, energy demand, and climate change. The Howry program supports projects designed to serve marginalized communities, but its principles demand that these projects are also authentic and co-equal, and we hope, sustainable and scalable. After a few short years since its founding, the Howry program can count on many successes, and many more are in the works. And I encourage you to visit howry.arizona.edu to learn more about her and her ongoing legacy. Tonight's conversation will touch on topics that are dear to the Howry program's mission. And throughout, we'll have an opportunity to hear from and engage with one of the world's most influential activists. But because of that, I ask that whatever your opinions, that you respect those of both our guests and your neighbors in the audience. I will not, however, ask you to turn off your cell phones. For the conversation, after it's over, we have allotted approximately 45 minutes for a question and answer session, your chance to ask Professor Chomsky whatever's on your mind. Well, just about whatever's on your mind. And to submit your questions, just take your mobile device to www.slido, that's slido.com, and type in event code #Chomsky2017 and send us a question. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Regents Professor Tony Massaro. She joined the faculty of UA's James E. Rogers College of Law in 1989, and she has held the Milton O. Reapy Chair in Constitutional Law for the past 20 years. From 1999 to 2009, she served as the Dean of the College of Law and was the first woman to hold that post. In 2006, she was named a Regents Professor by the Arizona Board of Regents. The Regents Professorship is the most prestigious faculty rank one can attain in the state of Arizona. Recipients are chosen by their peers for their exceptional achievements in scholarship and teaching. Among the works leading to her recognition were dozens of law review articles on constitutional law, shame penalties, and law and emotion, as well as 2 books, The Arc of Due Process in American Constitutional Law, published by Oxford, and Civil Procedure, Cases and Problems, which is now in its 5th edition. And I should also mention that in addition to her scholarship, she is an 8-time recipient of the Teacher of the Year Award from the College of Law. Now, I asked Professor Massaro to moderate tonight's event because of her tremendous intellect, but she is also the perfect choice insofar as she serves as the chair of the Howry Program Advisory Council, a role in which she upholds the highest ideals of Mrs. Howry. So thank you, Tony, for all you've done for the Howry Program and for agreeing to be part of tonight's event. Professor Massaro is joined tonight by one of the University of Arizona's most recent faculty appointments. Laureate Professor of Linguistics, Noam Chomsky. Formerly of MIT. The author of over 100 books and countless articles in his field, Professor Chomsky is widely recognized as the founder of modern linguistics. His ideas have revolutionized that field, of course, but they have also indelibly shaped anthropology, cognitive science, childhood education, computer science, the teaching and study of languages, mathematics, psychology, philosophy, and speech. This breadth of scholarship and innovation is why he is the world's most cited living academic. And I should add that his attraction to the University of Arizona is first and foremost because of our outstanding Department of Linguistics. Of course, there is also Noam Chomsky, the public intellectual, the self-described libertarian socialist, critic of established politicians on both the left and the right. An ardent free speech advocate, Chomsky has published and lectured widely on capitalism, the media, the Middle East, terrorism, and war. An activist who has influenced millions, he is well known for his insightful critiques of U.S. foreign policy, from his outspoken stance against the Vietnam War in his first political book, American Power and the New Mandarins, to his most recent book, Requiem for the American Dream. Those two works are mere bookends to 50 other volumes he has published on politics during his career, a career that is not over, for, as I understand it, 2 more books are appearing this year. For his global impact in support of social justice and the fight against environmental destruction, the Howry Program's donor-advised fund board was enthusiastic in bestowing upon Noam the title of Agnes Nelms Howry Chair, which is supporting his presence at the U of A, where he will be lecturing, teaching, and consulting with graduate and undergraduate students. And for that support, I am eternally grateful to the Howry trustees, Mary Greer, Greg Gadarian, and Tammy Barnett. Please join me in giving a warm Tucson welcome to Regents Professor Tony Massaro and UA Laureate Professor of Linguistics and Agnes Nelms Howry Chair, Noam Chomsky.
So I want to be sure you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Right. Welcome to Tucson. Welcome to the U of A. He's been here before, but never so completely one of us. We're delighted that you and your wife are here.
And we are too.
So I want to start for the audience to get to know you a little bit better before we get into some of the substantive themes. And one would be, if you were reflecting on your own life, on who or what shaped you the most, especially as it relates to the theme of social justice, how would you answer that question?
Well, it begins pretty early. I was growing up as a child in the 1930s during the Depression, the Deep Depression. My earliest childhood memories are people coming to the door trying to sell rags or something to try to survive. I recall riding in a trolley car with my mother passing a textile factory where women were on strike outside and being brutally beaten by security forces. Most of the family was first-generation immigrants, mostly unemployed workers, with a high level of cultural engagement, partly through the unions, which are, of course, very centers of activism, education, recreation, and so on. Partly just in the general, they were in New York, the general New York environment. They were part of the high culture scene, even though they were quite poor and unemployed. But the objective circumstances were much harsher than they are today. But rather strikingly, my memory is that there was a sense of hopefulness that's missing today. Striking difference. There was a sense somehow we're going to get out of this. We'll work together. There'll be a way out. There was a sympathetic administration. There were New Deal programs that didn't end the Depression, but they softened the edges, and they gave a sense that there is a way forward. The labor movement was mobilizing. It was a source of energy, activism, hopefulness for the future. All of that was positive. At the same time, I'm old enough to have listened to Hitler's speeches over the radio on the Nuremberg rallies, not understanding the words, but there was no mistaking the mood of the crowd that was cheering, and you could see that step by step Europe was succumbing to fascism. Italy, of course, was fascist well before I was born, but Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia. In fact, the first article I remember writing for school newspaper, fourth grade newspaper, I hope that it's disappeared and that nobody will ever find it. But I remember the first couple of sentences. And it's easy to date because it was immediately after the fall of Barcelona in February 1939, and it started by talking about the fall of one country after another, Spain, the next, Toledo, Barcelona. It looked inexorable. So there was, and we're Jewish. We happened to live in an area which was pretty harshly anti-Semitic. It was mostly Irish and German. In fact, it took me a while as I grew up to get over a visceral fear of Catholics because of the Irish kids down the street when they came out of the Jesuit school as raving anti-Semites. Later in the afternoon, things calmed down, you could play ball and that sort of thing. But all of this was an amalgam of, on the one hand, deep depression, but hope for the future. On the other hand, a sense that the world is succumbing to a fascist cloud that there's going to be no end to. So it was a dramatic period in many ways.
I'm interested in the fourth grader writing an essay on fascism. I'm sure the audience is too. And I really am. Here's somebody whose whole career is devoted to thinking about thinking and language. And I'm wondering if, and by the way, that essay that he wrote in fourth grade became the subject of a more major paper later at NYU. you discount your own genius, but nobody else does. And I'm wondering if you can say, were you conscious of being a little different from the other fourth graders?
Well, actually, that goes back earlier. My parents were teachers, Hebrew teachers, so I think I was put in a nursery school at about 18 months old, 20 months, and I have memories of nursery school, just kind of standing there and wondering, what are all these kids doing? You know, they all seem to be doing something. Well, I don't understand it. But I was at an experimental Deweyite school run by Temple University. It had a very progressive education department, and it was a very good school on Deweyite grounds. And there was no, it was a mixture of students, some of them students who couldn't make out in the behavioral problems in schools, others whose parents were oriented towards higher education, so a mix. But there was no sense of a ranking. It was not like when my own kids went to school in the 60s. By the time of third grade, they were describing other kids as smart and dumb. You know, the smart kids were in one level class, the dumb kids in another. We had nothing like that. There were no grades. There were no, of course, there were tests, but they were just for seeing how you're doing, what you have to do better, and so on. Actually, I skipped a grade, but nobody paid any attention. The only thing that was noticed is I was the smallest kid in the class. You know, otherwise, it didn't mean anything.
Something else that you've talked about that I think is probably something that came naturally to you, but you have a definition of true science that I really admire, which is, you said true science is a willingness to be puzzled by simple things. Do you think that can be taught?
I think that children have it. It's not so much a matter of being taught as a matter of being driven out of your head. I think it's natural with children. Your own children or young children that you deal with are puzzled about everything in the world, for strange things are happening. And it takes a rigid system of indoctrination and control to beat that out of people's heads. But the idea that, but modern science did really begin with a willingness to be puzzled about simple things. So if you go back to, say, the Galilean period, the reigning neo-scholastic doctrines had answers to all sorts of questions, like suppose this has boiling water in it, and I hold it like this, and I let go, the cup will fall and the steam will rise. And there was an answer. They're going to their natural place. I see you. What am I seeing? There's a form that's going through the air and getting into my brain, and that's how I see you. So we answered that question. And those were considered answers, going back to classical Greece. When Galileo and others decided to be puzzled about it and asked, why is the glass falling and the steam rising? How quickly are they falling? Would a stone and a feather fall at the same rate? And so on. Then you get the beginnings of modern science. And it's the same in my own field. Back in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, there were what were considered to be answers to the questions about the nature of language. In fact, as a student, as an undergraduate in the 1940s, the students in linguistics felt this is a lot of fun, but it's terminal. We know the answers to everything. It's just a matter of applying the methods we were taught to all the languages in the world, and then it's over. Turned out, when you began to think about it, you didn't understand anything. Everything was a puzzle. A lot of it remains not only puzzles, but deep mysteries. And ability to take a look at things that look obvious and say, well, why is it that way, which children do have, is, I think, actually the source of creative modern science, and it certainly can be taught. It's, in fact, there's a famous physicist at MIT, Victor Weisskopf, who was famous for having, in his freshman courses in physics, if students would ask him, what are we going to cover this semester? His answer was, doesn't matter what we cover, it matters what you discover. And then you proceed from there. If you learn how to question, to search, to find answers, then you're okay, whatever you've studied.
Well, we're going to be puzzled by some very big and seemingly intractable questions tonight. What holds them together is social justice, which, as the dean has explained, is a major theme for the Hari program, but it's a big, vague noun. You know, social justice, what is it to you?
Well, I think it's captured reasonably well by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the social and economic provisions, the second part of the 1948 Universal Declaration, especially Article 25, which lists freedom, so on. That's a good encapsulation of social justice. But it's, and of course all the countries, practically all the countries in the world signed up for it. No one observes it. But some more cynically than others. And it's an unattractive feature of our own country that it was rejected almost explicitly. So Jean Kirkpatrick, the Secretary of State under the Reagan administration, when she was asked about the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration, simply dismissed it as what she called a letter to Santa Claus. Paula Drobriansky, who's the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights under the first Bush administration later, said the idea that there are social and economic rights is a myth that we have to dispel. And in fact, if you look at the comparative records of the wealthy countries, the OECD countries, the richer countries, about 30 of them, the United States ranks very low. It ranks about 30th or 31st alongside of Greece and Turkey, poor countries, which is astonishing because we're the richest and most powerful country in world history with incomparable advantages. And in fact, there are severe attacks on social and economic rights proceeding right before our eyes. These are all issues that we should be deeply concerned about.
Some of it may be structural. The Constitution of the United States is a negative rights constitution. So the things that you name as critical to social justice are not constitutionally protected. Let's start with, you talk about health, and let's pivot to climate change and healthy environment. There are some young people who brought a lawsuit in which they're arguing that there should be a constitutional right to them as a future generation to a world in which the environment is inhabitable and safe. But it's definitely going to hit choppy water legally. You've talked about the doomsday clock, which was first set in the 1940s. Please tell the audience what that clock is and how it relates to the current status of our environment.
The doomsday clock was established in 1947. Shortly after the first, and so far luckily only, use of nuclear weapons by a distinguished group of physicists and brought in political analysts under the auspices of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It's the leading professional journal on nuclear issues. And it was set, it's the hand of the clock is set a certain distance from midnight. Midnight means terminal disaster, we're finished. The first setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight, and then it's oscillated over the years. In 1953, it reached the point closest to midnight, 2 minutes to midnight. That was because the United States first and later the Soviet Union had exploded hydrogen bombs. That signaled the fact that human intelligence had reached the point where we had created the means to completely wipe ourselves out and everyone else. And after that, it's gone up and back. A couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, it was moved, the clock was moved forward to 3 minutes to midnight. And at that point, for the first time, they took into account the effect of environmental catastrophe and the fact that it's not being both the threat of nuclear war, which had been the earlier concern, and now the threat of environmental catastrophe moved it to 3 minutes to midnight because the threats are not being addressed. Last January, immediately after the inauguration of President Trump, the clock was moved another half minute towards midnight, 2.5 minutes, closest it's been since 1953. Actually, there's one point when it would have been moved even closer. That was 1962, the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Would have been moved to 1 minute to midnight, but it happened that the crisis was not at the point where they made the annual decision, so it's not registered there. But in fact, there's an important book about the Cuban Missile Crisis called 1 Minute to Midnight. But that's where we stand. And I think, frankly, that I just had an interview with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists about this and suggested that last March should have been moved even closer to midnight. There was a remarkable discovery which should have been on the front pages everywhere, but is buried. A group of quite distinguished scientists dealing with nuclear weapons issue, Hans Christensen, Theodore Postel, a couple of others, published a very important article in which they gave a careful analysis of the nuclear weapons modernization programs that are being carried out started in the Obama administration, are being now escalated under the Trump administration. And they pointed out that these programs had succeeded in enhancing the killing capacity of the U.S. nuclear weapons force to the point where it could eliminate any deterrent. And they say explicitly this is the kind of program that would be used by a country that's planning a nuclear first strike and will be able to protect itself from any retaliation. They didn't argue that the United States is trying that. They don't think it is. But they say that any adversary would have to consider this. Now, the adversary that everyone has in mind, the only other major nuclear power is the Soviet Union, and Soviet strategists, of course, are perfectly aware of this. They have very limited detection systems, not like ours. Our detection systems are satellite controlled. You can detect the launch of a missile. Theirs are still radar controlled, so you're limited to the horizon. They have not much warning time. At a moment of tension, and there are unfortunately plenty of possible moments of tension, it's possible that strategic planners, say in Russia, would conclude there's a missile strike coming, we better send off all our missiles or we're finished, in which case we're all finished. And in fact, if you look at the history of the arms race, that has come very close quite a few times. Back in 1983, the Reagan administration had initiated a program called Able Archer. You can look it up on the internet. The idea was to test Russian defenses by simulating air, naval, and air and naval attacks on the Soviet Union, even including threatened nuclear attacks. And the point was to make all this obvious so we'd see how they react and then learn something about their defenses. Well, it turns out they took it pretty seriously. When the Russian archives finally came out, it turns out, not very surprisingly, that they were concerned that there was an actual plan for a missile attack. And you take a look at the U.S. strategic analyst journals, they now say we came very close to war inadvertently. Right about at that time, there was in the Soviet, we now know there was in the Soviet Union a warning of a U.S. missile attack. There are automated systems. Incidentally, our automated systems fail all the time. There are hundreds of cases where the automated systems have warned of a missile attack, but there was human intervention which prevented the response that's programmed. That's happened frequently, and our systems are much more sophisticated than theirs, so we can be sure that they had many more errors. Well, there was such a case in, I think it was 1984. There was a warning of an American missile attack by the automated systems. The protocol is that there's a particular officer who receives the information. His name happens to be Stanislav Petrov. He is supposed to transmit it to the higher military authorities. They decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. He simply decided not to transmit it. He concluded that there were not enough missiles detected to make it look like an authentic attack. So he just made a decision not to transmit the order. That's probably why we're here. Literally. And it's not the only time. He died recently, and some was recognized for having done this here, not in the Soviet Union, where he was not honored.
Artificial intelligence might make that situation worse because of may be programs that intervene without that human judgment call. But before, I have a follow-up on the nuclear threat. I want to go back a minute to the climate change, and I know you see both of these as two of the most important existential threats that we face. This is really a political question. Can't we assume that everybody cares enough about their children and their grandchildren and beyond that they want a livable world for them, which would mean to me an inhabitable climate without extreme weather and rising seas and the kind of environmental disruptions that imperil human life, on the one hand. If that's reasonable to assume, then question one, what explains the persistent political divide on the issue? And then the second part is if a lot of people believe things are that bad, that the doomsday clock is that close, why do they have children?
A lot of young people decide not to, for exactly that reason. That's happened before. In the early 60s, when the threat of nuclear war seemed very severe, there were young people who decided there's no point having children, why go on? But these questions are very poignant and severe right where we are. It's not a secret that we are the only country in the world that is refusing to participate since last November, since last January, in the international efforts to address the climate change threat. An international meeting is convening right now, in fact, COP23. There were 3 countries that didn't sign, that opposed the Paris Agreement. Of course, the United States was instrumental in initiating them under the Obama administration. But the Republican Party, not just President Trump, the entire Republican leadership takes the position that we shouldn't do anything about climate change. You take a look at the last primaries. Every single candidate, Republican candidate, either denied that what is happening, or said the moderates, Jeb Bush, Kasich, said, yes, it's probably happening, but we shouldn't do anything about it. So Kasich's position was, yes, of course, anthropogenic, human-initiated climate change is taking place, but the way he put it was, we're going to burn coal in Ohio, and we're not going to apologize for it, so we don't do anything about it. Now, there were three countries, the United States, Nicaragua, and Syria. Nicaragua and Syria had not joined the COP22, the earlier negotiations, Paris negotiations. Nicaragua hadn't joined because they thought the conditions were not stringent enough. They wanted to be much more correctly, I think, but they finally joined. Syria hadn't joined because they weren't able to send a delegate. Now they've both joined. That leaves the United States in splendid isolation, not only refusing to participate in the international efforts to deal with this impending catastrophe, but even dedicated to escalate the crisis by increasing the use of fossil fuels. And it's pretty remarkable to see. It's not just the administration. Just read the business pages of, not only in the United States, the Financial Times in London, the world's leading business journal, pretty liberal in general attitude. When they describe the prospects for fossil fuel production, it's euphoric. There's article after article talking about the wonderful prospects. They just discovered a new field somewhere, new deep digging, deep water exploration techniques will open up new fields in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a great thing, and so on, with barely a word saying that unless those fossil fuels are left in the ground, we're doomed. And it's pretty serious. Just recently, Stephen Chu, who's the former Nobel laureate in physics, who was the head of the energy department under Obama, gave a talk at the National Academy in which he pointed out that about 125,000 years ago, the Earth had a temperature just slightly above today's. And at that point, there were perhaps roughly 10 meters of, the sea level was about 10 meters, 6 to 10 meters higher than today. Just imagine life in a planet where the sea level was a couple of meters higher than it is now. He also pointed out that 800 million people live within about 30 meters of the seacoast. I mean, we're facing a monstrous catastrophe unless something is done quite seriously. And yet we're lagging behind. In fact, most of the world is as well. Some countries are doing better than others. Denmark is moving to close to 100% renewable energies. China, which is a major polluter, is taking pretty serious steps to cut back coal production, to move towards renewable energy, towards imposing sharp restrictions on automobile pollution and so on. We're outliers at this point. Not entirely, because states and localities are doing significant things in many cases, and individuals as well. But at the federal level, we're the sole country that is not committed formally to trying to address this very severe catastrophe. And some of the things that are happening are almost surreal. There's Senate hearings that are taking place on President Trump's latest appointment, nominee for a high position in the environmental agency, Hartnett White, I think her name is. Her view is that to talk about climate change is paganism. The governor of your state, Wisconsin, Scott Walker, denies climate change, but he's willing to talk about climate resilience. So we're allowed to plan for climate resilience, meaning do something to deal with the catastrophe that's coming, but we're not allowed to call it climate change. I mean, this kind of denialism is, I can't think of words to describe it. It's utterly shocking. In fact, November 8th was a pretty striking date in that respect. November 8th, of course, the date of the American election. At the same time, in Morocco, Marrakesh, Morocco, there was an international conference underway, COP21, which was a follow-up to the Paris negotiations that was intended to put, incidentally, the Paris negotiations themselves, 2015, were aimed at a verifiable treaty, but that had to be withdrawn because the Republican Congress would not have tolerated it. So it had to be a voluntary agreement, which of course much weaker. COP22 in Morocco was intended to carry this forward. On November 8th, the World Meteorological Organization delivered its description of the state of the climate and the threats, and it was a pretty dire warning. That was November 8th. After that, the conference basically pretty much terminated. It turned to the question of how the world can go forward with the most important, powerful country in the world, in fact, most powerful in world history, pulling out of the effort. That's our responsibility. It's very serious. Going back to your question, I don't know the answer. I don't know how people can face this prospect, see what's going to be the lives for their own children and grandchildren, and not be willing to dedicate themselves to it.
I'm puzzled by that simple thing. But, you've alluded to two things that I think might give us a little optimism. One is the cities and the states that are reacting, but there's lots of reason to think that won't be enough, and I agree with you there. And then there are those who think science can save us, that there will be strategies that emerge there. But in the short run, the HARI program, this is this terrific Tucson now-based program that's trying to act strategically for our region and the world. Say that you're on the board with the people responsible for allocating funds and grants. And it's not open to them to say there's nothing we can do. They want to intervene. What advice would you give them about how to choose among projects in the short run to try to advance this ball?
Well, even something as simple as using LED lights has a very significant impact. The shifts of the transportation system to public transportation or even to less destructive automobiles would be a significant effect. Solar panels for heating, especially a place like Arizona, where the sun's shining all the time. It's kind of shocking not to see solar panels everywhere, on every house, and that can be done. There are steps that can be taken from the individual level to the federal level to the international level that can make a major impact. The optimistic part of this is that we do have the capacity to not to end the threat, but at least to significantly mitigate it and to ensure that there will be likelihood, high probability that organized human life can continue at a proper level. We have that capacity if we can use it.
I want to pick up on something else that you were talking about. I mean, it's astonishing, the retreat of the United States from the Paris Accord, but it's part of a larger phenomenon, I think, and I'm wondering what you think might explain it, that the United States has, in so many respects now, retreated from globalism, and there's been a corresponding, I think not unrelated, rise in populism. And I'm wondering why now. With respect to the retreat, we can look to the travel ban, to the wall, to anti-sanctuary jurisdiction penalties, the plight of so many refugees, including environmental refugees, the weakening of the State Department and global diplomacy and other parts of the federal government that are best positioned in most cases to deal with things from a national and an international perspective. What is going on?
Well, the United States is an unusual country in many ways. For one thing, by comparative standards, it's a huge country. It has internal resources, agriculture, minerals, relatively homogeneous population once the native population was pretty much exterminated. It's been able to, for much of its history, though the by 1900, the United States was far and away the biggest economy in the world, in fact richer than the next several economies put together. But it was not a major actor in the world. It was a kind of an observer, had its own, conquered the territory, expanded some, but it was not. The major international actors were England, France. The United States was behind. The United States looked inward. And in fact, as late as before the Second World War, let's say the 1930s, if somebody in the United States wanted to be a physicist, let's say, chances are they'd go to Germany. Or if you wanted to be a writer or an artist, you go to France. You didn't stay here. I mean, I saw this myself when I was started teaching at MIT in the 1950s. One of the things, one of the kinds of sort of, I hate to call it a course, but the things that I were teaching were fake courses where you tried to teach graduate students how to fake their way through reading exams in German and French. And this went on until the 1960s. And it was a residue of the pre-war period when the great science was done in French and German. If you wanted to be an engineer or physicist in the 1920s, 1930s, you had to read French and German. By the time of the Second World War, that was over. The United States then became preeminent geopolitically, many other respects. So the idea, and of course students didn't have to read French and German anymore because everything was in English. But there was a kind of a lag, took about 15 years before this was finished. But that's a sign of what the country was like. The country was a cultural backwater. And now the Second World War did change that, but only for part of the country. Part of it remains what it was, kind of internationally a cultural backwater. And we see that in many different respects, and many different measures. And it's showing up now in these almost the cosmic level of threat of global destruction. It means there's a huge educational effort required in the United States to bring about an understanding of the nature of the world in which we live. And you can see easily why this should be the case. I mean, there's no other country where you can travel 3,000 miles and seem to be in the same place from where you started. You go from Boston to Los Angeles, let's say. The stores are the same, the language is the same, the people look the same, a little bit of difference, but not much. If you're in Europe and you go 100 miles, it's culturally different, different language, and so on. So the understanding that there's a rich, complex world is just part of life in most of the world, but not here. It's partly just because of the history. Immigrants came, eliminated the indigenous population, spread over the continent, developed their own unique life, which in many ways was the most advanced in the world. I don't have to tell you, the U.S. Constitution was well beyond anything that existed in the world in terms of progressive values at the time. And that's all on the positive side. Much of it remains, but there's a negative side too.
Well, though there's also, we're not alone in this impulse away from global partnerships and or in the rise in populism. I think that's happening in Europe as well. But let me do let me focus on a few things that some people have suggested have huge explanatory power. In addition to this, we're a big island and we think of ourselves as the center of the universe that you've just named. Let's talk about race. You know, I think of Ta-Nehisi's Coates' the first white president essay in the Atlantic Monthly. And Ta-Nehisi's thesis is that race was doing the resistance to globalism and the rise in populism, and so it's a race resentment. Others would say, and I would be one of them, that don't forget about gender. It's consistently eluded and discounted as a contributing factor. Religion, which you've written about and observed, is a cultural universal, but face it, religion has inherent secessionist aspects to it. You're faithful to the religion, it can mean defiance of collective norms, the authority of the secular world, mandates like non-discrimination. All these things may have been part of the oleo of things and of just the brute economic despair of some people in the United States that said, we've had it. We're going in another direction. What do you think about these possible explanations for where we are right now?
I think all of those are factors, but there's an overriding factor that should not be ignored, and that's simply economic and political policy. The post-war period, post-World War II, there have been really two phases of social and economic policy. The first phase was what's sometimes called regulated capitalism, roughly Second World War up to the mid-1970s. There was the New Deal regulations were in place in the financial system. There were no financial crises. Banks were banks. They were places where you put extra money and they'd lend it to somebody for starting a business, sending the kid to college, whatever it was. There was a sharp break. There was the highest growth period in history, sustained growth period, fairly egalitarian growth. The lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. There was a sense of steady, constant progress. There was also progress on social issues. The civil rights movement developed, bare beginnings of the women's rights movement. There was the early stages of the environmental movement. All of this was taking place through the 1950s and 60s. Labor activism was significant, in fact, rising by the early 70s. There was militant labor organizing by women in service industries and so on, as well as the farmers' workers and so on. All of that was taking place. This essentially ended by the late 70s, really took off under Reagan. The same was happening internationally, Reagan and Thatcher. We moved to a different phase, the neoliberal phase, the phase that undercuts social commitments, turns to freed up financial institutions to become monstrous, investment-oriented, predatory institutions, not crisis after crisis, each worse than the last. Essential stagnation for most of the population in wages and incomes. In fact, by 2007, which was the peak of success of the neoliberal program, lots of euphoria about what was called the Great Moderation, everything's wonderful. Real wages for American workers were below what they were in 1979 when the experiment began. That is the background, and that's pretty much the same as happening in Europe with what they call the austerity programs. This has also led to a decline in democracy. As wealth and income concentrate and much of the population stagnates in wealth and income, that translates at once into political choices and legislation by almost obvious mechanisms, and it keeps the vicious cycle going. It's true also, and what's now called populism, it's not a very good term in my view, but what it is a general anger and contempt for institutions, which has plenty of justification. The institutions are not working for people, so they, you can see it in the electoral system. So the recent elections in Europe, almost every one is an attack on the centrist parties that have been governing, the center-left, center-right parties. They're undermined. You get the forces on either side coming up. Same happened here. The most dramatic aspect of the 2016 election here was not so much the election of Trump, the nomination of Trump. It's not that surprising for a billionaire with huge economic support and massive media support to be nominated as a party candidate. Little unusual, but not off the spectrum. What really broke with 100 years of political history was the Sanders campaign. This is somebody who came out of nowhere. Nobody knew him. Used the scare word socialist, which meant basically New Dealer. No financial support, no media support. Probably would have won the Democratic Party nomination if it hadn't been for machinations of party managers, might have won the election. That's completely a total break from American political history, which is a history of pretty much bought elections. There's substantial academic political science research which shows quite convincingly that a very good predictor of electoral success is simply campaign spending. And so that's not only true of president, but also of the Senate and House. A very good study that came out about a year ago from a fine political scientist at UMass Boston, Tom Ferguson, and a couple of colleagues who've done most of the work on this. They did a study of House and Senate elections from mid-'80s to the present, just asking to what extent can you predict electoral success simply by campaign spending? And it's almost a straight line. It's the kind of prediction you rarely get in the social sciences. And that means, of course, not just electoral success, but legislative programs. The Sanders campaign broke radically from that. And it's similar to what's happening in, say, the French election, where a candidate who came out of, also didn't come out of the political system, Macron won the election, and the major parties were marginalized. I think a lot of this is simply the effect of the collapse of the, I wouldn't say collapse, but the turn of political institutions to service to extreme wealth and corporate power, neglecting the population, which you see in all sorts of ways. And naturally that leads to anger, fear, irrationality, policies that can be, and sometimes are, hopeful and constructive, but can be very destructive as well. It's leading to, in Europe, what's sometimes called illiberal democracy, like Orban in Hungary, where you have democratic forms, but really authoritarian structures. A lot of this, I think, is simply the result of the shift to the neoliberal market-oriented programs, which diminish the role of individuals in society in favor of concentrated wealth and power, which tend to escalate. And in fact, if you take a look at Trump voters, they're mostly moderately affluent, petty bourgeois, some working class, but that's not the overwhelming majority. But these are people who feel that, with justice, that things have stagnated. There was, it's partly myth, but partly reality. There was a sense that each generation is doing better than the last. We're moving forward. There's a better future, and so on. That came to an end. Our children are not going to do better than we do. The opportunities are not going to be greater, except for a very small and shrinking minority. And that sense is overwhelming, and I think you can trace it to the socioeconomic decisions that were made that shifted the nature of policy. These are choices. They're not economic necessities. They're specific choices. You see them in the structure of the World Trade Organization agreements, which are basically investor rights agreements. Don't have to be that way. There are other ways for international trade to be organized. This has been happening now for a generation, and the population reacts. Now that interacts with the factors that you mentioned, which are certainly there. Race and gender, religion and others are major factors. In the United States, they take particular forms related to our own history, which we can go into. But
Well, there's a lot in that. I think you're describing beautifully a structural phenomenon and driven by some economic principles, the neoliberalism that you've identified in your work, that translates into or may produce the economic stratification and despair. But I wonder, I don't think that the average voter understands that at all.
The average voter understands that there's an image that's been used, which I think captures it very accurately. It was actually used by Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist who studied the Louisiana bayous and tried to figure out how the people. It's a very sympathetic report of people who feel. This is basically deep red, Republican people who vote for candidates who are destroying the bayou in which they live, but are themselves environmentalists. They want to preserve it. Try to figure out what's going on. Why are people apparently voting against their own interests? What she comes up with is an image that the people themselves accepted when she interacted with them, that we're standing in a line. Behind us are our parents and grandparents. They worked hard, made a better life for us. We should be moving forward, but we're not. The line has stopped. Ahead of us, there are some people going to the stratosphere, but that doesn't bother us much. What bothers us is that we're stuck. And why are we stuck? Because the federal government is working for the people behind us, the immigrants, African Americans, Hispanics, people back there, worthless people who aren't really working the way we do and our parents do, and they're putting them ahead of us. So you get this kind of attitude. And that people can understand. They can understand that the line that we're in has stopped moving forward. There's an interesting study that just came out yesterday, I think, in maybe the Washington Post, an analysis. A journalist went to a former steel city, Johnstown, Ohio, which was a major steel mining area, and very pro-Trump. And he was interested in finding out how do the people react to the fact that Trump has not come through on any of the promises that he made. In fact, he didn't go into it, but he's actually making their lives worse. How do they feel about that? And the answer that surprised them, surprised me, is that they don't care. They say, we know he's never going to bring back the steel mills. We know the promises are all nonsense. But we don't care. He expresses our anger. Every crazy thing he does, we like, because he's thumbing his nose at those people who are our enemies, who have made the progress stop for us. Our town is over. It's never going to reconstitute. There'll never be steel mills. Our children will go away. It's all collapsing. We can't have the old life that we thought we were going to have. But at least we can express our anger at the people who are doing this to us. They don't know who's doing it to them. I mean, that's a different question. But you can see it's a framework in which scapegoating works very well. And the fact that we had a black president was not a small factor. The racism just exploded. That's why you have 25% of Republicans thinking that Obama's maybe Antichrist. I think a majority of Republicans, I forget the exact number, think he's a Muslim who came from Kenya, things like that. A lot of that is just a reflection of deep-seated American racism, which goes right back to the origin of the country. It's never been eradicated.
I want to shift. I know we started a little bit late now, and I have time for the audience. But I recommend to everybody Requiem for the American Dream, which is one of his more recent books. And in it, Dr. Chomsky says that what we need is a functioning democracy with informed persons. And I want to shift to how does that happen, and given the disruptions in or the flaws in the marketplace of ideas and freedom of speech model. Your definition of a functioning democracy includes the notion of informed persons. But let me just challenge that with two clusters. Why should we believe that freedom of speech and persuasion are going to help promote critical engagement and an informed electorate today, given two things, or two clusters of obstacles? And the first one is we the people. We are poor thinkers. We don't seek enlightenment. There's all the more studies that coming out of the CogSci area suggest that you accepted, but most of us aren't in fourth grade thinking things through in a careful way. We have wildly imperfect human brains. We live in information silos, choosing the bubbles, And with our cognition weaknesses and our confirmation biases, the big and striking insight is that we're not looking for facts. We're not looking for truth. We're not looking for enlightenment. We're looking to be entertained often or assuaged in some way. And we use information to persuade other people, and that's not necessarily based on the facts. So that's cluster one. We're not good at thinking, the audience. And cluster two, you've written a lot about. The people talking to us, sets of them have distorting influences that make it very difficult for us to extract the truth. You're very critical of the mainstream media. The propaganda model of the corporate mass media is something you've written about. There's every reason to be skeptical of government. If you don't like an idea, just cut off the funding. Or if you think people shouldn't, taking a knee is unpatriotic, say things like fire the SOBs. Third thing that you've pointed out that I think is very worrisome too is social media under private control. They are the new censors, and we may not even know the extent to which they're distilling information. And then finally, sorry for the long question, you blame us, campus leaders, that we're craven. We've created architectural plans so that large demonstrations can't be possible. We've hiked student debt, created debt peonage, and have adopted a kind of business model for a complicated set of reasons, but that all these things make it harder for the audience to get good information in the first place, even if we knew what to do, if we could think straight through it.
Plenty of barriers, no doubt. But the point is they're all surmountable. Every one of these things that you mentioned is a human decision, and human decisions can be changed. You don't have to have a business model for the universities is a choice and a decision can be eliminated. There was a time when, I don't want to claim there was a golden age, there always were plenty of problems, but there was a time when public education, higher public education in the United States was essentially free. We were a much poorer country in the 1940s and the 50s, much poorer than we are today, but education was pretty much free. The GI Bill gave free education, actually subsidized education, to a substantial part of the population, incidentally, white male population. That's a reflection of the phenomena that you were describing. But a large part of the white male population, which never would have gone to college, was given the opportunity to do so. And it was rewarding for them, and it was beneficial for the country. Even private colleges were, they weren't free, but it was nothing like today. So for example, in 1945, I went to University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League college. It was $100 a year. That's, what is it, maybe $800 today. And it was very easy to get a scholarship. The United States was at that time very much like what many other countries are like today. Other countries, from rich to poor, have pretty free higher education. So Germany, which is maybe the most successful state capitalist economy, higher education is essentially free. Finland, which has the highest records almost every year in educational attainment, education's free. Right next to us, Mexico, poor country. UNAM, the higher education system, is a pretty high level. I've lectured there and appreciated the level of education, but it's free. Now, rich and poor countries can do it. The United States itself did it when it was a much poorer country. There's no reason why that can't happen right now. There's no economic reasons for it.
I feel compelled to add that's also the Morrill Act, and we are a land-grant university, and the idea that these places would be created to serve the community was born during the Civil War era. Things can be very, very bad, and there can be people who rise up and say this is essential.
I should say that that's one of the achievements of the United States, was to create mass higher education. The land-grant system, others. The United States was really a pioneer in mass public education. So it's kind of shocking that we're now going back to the back of the line.
Yeah. I'm glad for your optimism there, to say the least. Let me close this part with more of a fun question that comes from my friend Tim Good. Assume I have in my pocket a one-time golden key, and it's going to allow you total access to a folder in the bowels of the United States government that's never, in the archives, never been seen before. Nobody's ever accessed it with a FOIA request, and the only rule is that the folder can't be about you. All right? What folder would you choose and why?
There are a lot of attractive possibilities. So, for example, there were just recently there was a new trove of internal documents released about the U.S. Involvement in the overthrow of the government of Iran in 1953. But a lot was apparently redacted. It'd be interesting to see what wasn't told. And there are many things like that. But the case that I would use the golden key for myself, and that puzzles me and interests me in many ways, is the build-up to what has been described as the most dangerous moment in history, which we already discussed, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Phrases Arthur Schlesinger's historian, Kennedy confidant, quite accurately described the 1962 missile crisis as the most dangerous moment in history. How did it come about? We only have very limited information about that, and it's tantalizing. Why did Nikita Khrushchev decide to put missiles in Cuba? Okay. Well, scholarship pretty much agrees that there were two major reasons. One was a major terrorist campaign that the Kennedy administration was waging against Cuba. Schlesinger's words, the campaign was bringing the terrors of the earth to Cuba. It was under the control of Robert Kennedy. It was his prime responsibility was to organize a mass terrorist campaign against Cuba. It's not much discussed here, but it was pretty serious. And it was intended to lead to an uprising, perhaps followed by an American invasion in October 1962. That's when the missiles were placed. We don't know for sure that the Cubans and the Russians were aware of all the details, but it's quite possible that they at least surmised and perhaps knew that an invasion was planned in October 62. That's one factor. And the nature of this campaign is pretty shocking. Actually, something was just released recently, hidden in the back pages, when the Kennedy archives were just released, the assassination archives. A lot of publicity about that. You know, a lot of talk about what sleazy operations were going on, who was doing this and that. But there was something hidden in there, which I think was something that really should be pursued. Turns out that at one point, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor, serious intellectual, former dean. That impresses you, right?
Not really.
Former dean of Harvard. He was a leading liberal intellectual. He was asked, about using chemical and biological warfare against Cuba as part of the campaign. And he responded that he thought that would be appropriate if we could make sure that we're never identified as the source. I'd like to learn a little more about that. So that's one aspect. The other thing that was happening was, it's actually sort of related to North Korea today. When Khrushchev came into power in Russia, a couple of years after Stalin died, he understood that Russia could not compete with the United States economically. It's far less developed country. And the arms race was an overwhelming burden which prevented Russian economic development. Actually, North Korea today is taking the same position. It's worth thinking about. And what he proposed that there be a mutual sharp reduction of offensive military weapons. The United States, incidentally, was way ahead in every respect. He proposed this to the Kennedy administration, and in fact, even unilaterally moved to cut back offensive Russian forces. The Kennedy administration considered it, rejected it, and initiated the biggest arms growth in history in response. Well, part of Khrushchev's placing the missiles in Cuba was apparently an effort to try to compensate slightly for this tremendous imbalance. Those 2 years, 61 and 62, it would be really interesting to discover what the thinking in detail was that led to these decisions, and they are decisions, remember, that's important, that led to the most dangerous moment in history. I think it would be extremely interesting to find out what they were thinking. This was an administration of, the best and the brightest, as they called themselves, leading intellectuals, Harvard, MIT intellectuals. What were they thinking when they made these decisions?
Just like today. Let me see if I can, okay. This is going to enable me
Tony,
to watch CNN, apparently. That's not what it's supposed to do.
Tony,
Just a minute. Yes, sir.
Can I take a minute?
Most certainly.
Yeah, I'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
Let me take this moment while we're waiting for Noam to return, so you won't have to hear this at the end. Tomorrow night at the Loft Cinema, and specifically at the Loft Film Fest, Professor Chomsky will be honored with the Lofty Achievement Award. He's appeared in over 25 films, so he is very deserving of this award. And in recognition of the award, there will be an 25th anniversary screening of the film based on his book, Manufacturing Consent. And that event is, if it's not completely sold out, it's almost entirely sold out. So if you want to make your way over there tomorrow night, I recommend going a little early and seeing if you can get one of the specially reserved tickets. Next week, in collaboration with various community partners, SBS is co-hosting 2 featured events on women's empowerment and human rights to coincide with International Education Week. The first of these is a screening of the documentary film The Tent Village by Nelima Abrams on Tuesday, November 14th at 6 p.m. at the Loft, and that is also nearly sold out, and a few tickets are available on the Loft's website. And then secondly, SBS is pairing up with YWCA and a number of other community organizations and partners to bring international actor and activist, and get this, UA PhD in molecular and cellular biology, Dipti Mehta, who will present her one-woman play, Honor, Confessions of a Mumbai Courtesan, on Friday, November 17th at 7 p.m. at the Temple of Music and Art. And you can find tickets there by going to our calendar, sbs.arizona.edu/events. And this is a benefit for the YWCA, and portions of the proceeds will go to supporting their important work for women and children in Southern Arizona. And then, finally, I'm pleased to announce that this coming spring semester, we're thrilled once again to offer the opportunity for community members as well as undergraduates to participate in the course, What is Politics?, which will be co-taught by Professor Chomsky and my colleague, Professor Marv Waterstone. Now, UA students will have priority for this class, but registration for our new SBS Community Classroom will open on November 29th with a limited number of seats available for community members on a first-come, first-served basis. So keep an eye on our website, communityclassroom.arizona.edu, and we'll release more details about the course and how to register. Okay, so back to the show. Thanks for your patience.
So we have time for a few questions. One of them is, are you going to run for president in 2020? And then there's a little one in the audience who wants to know if you can't speak, how can you think?
Sorry?
If you can't speak, how can you think? This is a question from a 7-year-old, and it proves your point about kids, doesn't it? Right. More to the. That's too tough for him to answer. Tell your child. It's too hard. So another one would be, say a little more about social media and the control that in the private hands of information, and what you think that means for the future.
Well, social media have had an interesting impact on our social, cultural, and political life. It's been pretty well discussed. I'm not saying anything you don't know. On the one hand, they do offer opportunities for expression, for reaching out to other people. They're the main technique of organizing these days. They're the means by which teachers communicate with their students, both groups organize and form and interact. They provide options, which unfortunately often aren't used, to go to media sources, information sources that are otherwise rarely available. All of that is positive. On the other hand, as has been well studied, they do form bubbles. People, and I think I do it myself, I'm not blaming others, we tend to go towards the sources that basically we accept and agree with their general point of view. When you read a newspaper, whatever one thinks of the main media, you read the New York Times, you're at least seeing some range of opinion. If you go only to the sources that reinforce your own views, you do end up with self-reinforcing enclosed bubbles which separate from one another. And that's been one of the factors that has led to a pretty dramatic polarization in the United States. I mean, you go back 30 or 40 years, if a person was a Republican or a Democrat, it didn't make much difference. You interacted, your friends, intermarried, all sorts of things. Statistics are pretty striking. By now, these are almost separate groupings. And it's led to a degree of kind of fanaticism connected with the political labels. So there was recently an interesting study of just Republicans, not Trump voters, Republicans. A majority, slight majority, connection with 2020, a slight majority said that if Trump decided to delay or cancel the elections, they'd go along with it. There was one question that was asked was, what do you believe? You know, what are the sources you believe? Trump was kind of up in the stratosphere. The major media, practically nothing. Even Fox News was low. This is a very dangerous phenomenon of almost worship for a charismatic leader that I've felt all my life, frankly, and wrote all my life, that if the United States ever had an honest, charismatic leader, we'd be in deep trouble. I mean, a Hitler type, someone who's not a crook, not a thug, you know, but dedicated fascist leader. I think the country is the kind of country that could succumb to that. And I think we've seen signs of it over the years. It's never happened. Joe McCarthy, for example, was just too much of a thug. Richard Nixon was, you know, couldn't, he just didn't have that capacity. You know? But somebody might come, and I don't think Trump is either, just too much of a con man. But somebody could come along who could take this anger, fear, sense of betrayal, you know, everyone's against us, and our lives are collapsing, and organize contribute to that. And when you were talking about all the barriers that there are towards developing an informed, educated, understanding population that's the basis for any functioning democratic society, this is one of them. But we should bear in mind that there's nothing inherent about this. I mean, I mentioned before at the beginning that in the 1930s, a much more desperate period in objective terms. The working class was large parts of the working class were not only educated and informed, but really part of high culture. And that goes way back. You go back to the 19th century, the early days of the Industrial Revolution. If an Irish blacksmith in Boston, who may have been illiterate, had a little bit of money, he would hire a boy to read to him while he's working. And read to him meant read what we call classics, that is contemporary literature. You take a look at this fascinating literature from what are called the factory girls, the young women from the farms who moved into the textile factories around the Boston area. That's the beginnings of the American Industrial Revolution, mid-19th century. They had their own journals. They published the journals, and the journals, one of the things that they bitterly condemned the industrial system, as did male workers as well, which was taking away their freedom, turning them into automata under the control of others. They were selling themselves instead of selling their products, losing their dignity and rights as free Americans, bitter condemnations of the industrial system. And one of the condemnations is taking away their culture. They had a live, rich culture. There's a study of the British working class, 1,000-page detailed academic study by Jonathan Rose of just the reading habits of the British working class. He concludes they were better educated than the aristocrats. There's nothing inherent in having an ignorant population. It's a very modern phenomenon. Partly it's related to the breakdown of unions, which were a center for organization, education, cultural activities, activism. and it can be reconstituted. I mean, I've seen it all over. Incidentally, I should say that you also see in populations which have very little education that they have a deep understanding of the way the world works. We have it in our own history. There was an authentic populist movement in the United States, not what's called populism today, but the populism of the late 19th century. The radical farmers began in Texas, spread to Kansas, other Midwestern states, became organized. They wanted to free themselves from the control of the Northeastern bankers, merchants who were basically dominating, controlling their lives. And they didn't have much formal education. Most of them probably barely went to school, but they had a very careful and accurate understanding of the social and economic forces that were governing their lives, and they organized very effectively to try to overcome them. It was finally crushed by force, but it was very significant, maybe the most democratic movement in American history. Actually, a lot of the people fled to the north afterwards and became part of the Labor Democratic base of Canada, part of the reason why Canada has had more progressive politics. All of this is real and can certainly be reconstituted.
We've exported the wrong things. A second question that someone in the audience had goes back to the first set of questions we asked you, and it's about your intellectual journey. Everyone knows that your footprint in linguistics is deep and abiding, and one of the most important figures. But here you've had, in all of this tonight, such an impact in the realm of social justice and as a public intellectual. Why didn't you stay in your lane?
Pardon?
Why? What possesses you? What drives you to engage people on these issues beyond your narrow field of expertise?
Well, I am asked that occasionally, but I find it kind of puzzling because it seems to me the right question is, why doesn't everyone do it? And these, the problems are, it's not deep, it's not quantum physics. We can all handle it, we can all deal with it. It's of enormous significance for our own lives, the lives of people we care about, for the world, for future generations. It's just hard to understand why it isn't a leading factor in everybody's normal life. For many people it is. Should be for many more.
I told you he wasn't a normal fourth grader. So a third question before we do the final one of the night has to do with the young people in the audience and or those who may watch this later. If they wanted to pursue a path of social justice, what should they be doing now, and what should they be studying? Where would you guide them? Say it was one of your own grandchildren coming to you and saying, I very much admire the way you've lived your life. I would like to do it too in these times and the ones that lie ahead. What would you tell him or her?
Well, I get a lot of letters from young people asking pretty much that question. And I'm reduced to almost a form answer. Nobody can give you that advice. These are things you have to figure out for yourself. There are many different ways to live a very positive, very constructive life for yourself and for others. Many different paths to follow. And you just have to find out which are the right ones for you. College is an opportunity, should be at best an opportunity to explore these options. It does, this university, others offer many opportunities for exploration and investigation. I should say one of the most educational experiences I ever had was as When I was lucky to get a postdoctoral position at Harvard for 4 years, in which I just had a desk in the Widener Library, a great library, and just walking around the library and exploring was seeing the treasures of human thought and civilization in front of you, just as it opens up endless prospects for journeys and investigations. And that's only one kind of work. There's plenty of other ways to live, which make a big difference in life. So you just have to find the right way for yourself. We differ.
And the last question of the night, I think you actually have answered, but let's ask it directly. Why should we be optimistic? Why should we be optimistic?
Why should we be optimistic? Well, we basically have two choices. We can decide that everything's hopeless, give up, help make sure that the worst will happen. Or we can recognize that there are opportunities, there are significant challenges, there are ways of addressing them. Whatever the possibility, we can grasp the opportunities. Maybe we'll make a better world for ourselves and others. It's not a real choice.
Thank you, Noam. Welcome to Tucson. Thank you, Tony Massaro. And thank the audience for tonight. Thank you.